Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're 10 years old again. Can you remember your favorite meal? The smell of your home? Your mother's voice calling you for dinner? Your best friend's laugh? Now imagine all of that. Gone. Erased. Stripped away piece by piece until you can't remember what happiness feels like. Until you can't recall why protecting people matters. Until the faces of those you kill blur together into nothing. This is what happens when you become a Space Marine. They call them angels. Superhumans. The Emperor's chosen warriors. 8-foot-tall giants wrapped in armor, carrying weapons that can level buildings. Every child in the Imperium dreams of becoming one. Every parent prays their son will be selected for this honor. But here's what they don't tell you in the recruitment posters. Here's what the propaganda films never show. To become an angel, you must first forget you were ever human. And once you forget, you can never remember again. This is the story of Brother Marcus. A Space Marine who served the Imperium for over 400 years. A hero who saved billions of lives. A legend who never lost a battle. And a man who slowly realized he had lost something far more important than any war. The boy who had everything to lose. Marcus was 11 years old when his world changed forever. He lived on a farming planet called Verdant 7. Nothing special. Just endless fields of golden wheat, small settlements of hard-working families, and skies that turned purple at sunset. His father worked the harvest machines. His mother baked bread before dawn, filling their small home with the smell of honey and warm grain. Marcus had a younger brother named Thomas. They were best friends. They played war games in the fields, pretending to be Space Marines fighting monsters. They laughed until their sides hurt. They made plans about the future, about taking over their father's farm someday, about the adventures they would have. It was a simple life. A good life. A life that was about to end. The thunder started just after lunch. Not weather thunder, something deeper, more mechanical. Something that made the ground shake. Marcus and Thomas climbed the tallest grain tower to see what was happening. Their small hands gripped the rusty ladder as they climbed higher and higher toward the sound. When they reached the top, they saw something that changed everything. 12 metal pods falling from the sky like burning stars. They crashed into the earth around their settlement in perfect formation, each impact sending up clouds of dust and smoke. Then the ramps lowered. And they emerged. Space Marines. Even from a distance, Marcus knew what they were. Every child knew. The Imperium's greatest warriors. Angels of death. Superhumans created to protect humanity from the monsters lurking in the darkness of space. But seeing them in person was different than seeing them in picture books. They were massive, each one nearly 3 times the height of a normal man. Their armor sang with embedded hymns as they moved. Each footstep shook the ground. When they spoke, their voices boomed like thunder. They weren't angels. They were something else. Something that made Marcus feel a fear he had never experienced before. They had come for recruitment, they announced. The Space Marine chapter needed new candidates, and Verdant 7 had been chosen for the honor of providing them. Every boy between 10 and 12 years old would be tested. The worthy would join the Emperor's armies. The rest would return to their families. Marcus's mother cried when they called his name. Not tears of joy, like the settlement leader told everyone to feel. Different tears. Tears that spoke of something ending. Of loss. Of goodbye. She knew, somehow. Knew that even if her son survived the selection process, he would never really come home. The thing that came back, if anything came back, would wear Marcus's face but carry none of his heart. The testing was brutal and fast. Physical examination. Genetic screening. Psychological evaluation. 300 boys entered the testing facility. Only 7 passed. Marcus was one of them. Thomas was not. Marcus still remembers the look in his brother's eyes when the examiner moved on without recording his data. Relief mixed with disappointment. Pride mixed with sadness. Thomas was safe. But Thomas would never become a space marine. And somewhere deep inside, Marcus envied him. They were allowed no goodbyes. No final meals with family. No last nights in familiar beds. The chaplain explained that attachment to their former lives would only weaken them. They were no longer children of Verdant 7. They were Space Marine recruits. Their old identities didn't matter anymore. That's when Marcus began to understand. This wasn't an honor. This was an ending. But it was too late to go back. The journey to hell. The ship was called the Righteous Conviction. A massive battle cruiser that could carry thousands of soldiers and enough weapons to destroy entire cities. To Marcus, it looked like a flying cathedral, dark, imposing, and filled with shadows. He spent 3 months in that ship's lower decks with 46 other boys. They came from everywhere. Farm boys like him. Street fighters from city gangs. Tribal warriors from jungle death worlds. Rich kids from civilized planets. None of that mattered here. They were all the same now. All recruits. All expendable. The first lesson came quickly: survival was not guaranteed. The ship's medical staff began the preliminary procedures immediately. Implanting the first organs. Testing genetic compatibility. Pushing their young bodies to see what would break and what would adapt. Some boys died on the operating tables. Their bodies rejected the implants. Others died during training exercises, their bones snapping under weights designed for grown men. A few went insane, their minds unable to handle what was being done to them. Those were the lucky ones. They died fast. By the time the ship reached its destination, only 32 of the original 47 boys remained alive. Nobody mourned the dead. They were forbidden to. Grief was weakness, the instructors said. Attachment was a liability. Those who showed emotion were punished with additional conditioning, drugs, hypnosis, and in extreme cases, surgical modification of their brain chemistry. Marcus learned quickly. He stopped learning the names of the other boys. Stopped making friends. Stopped feeling anything when someone disappeared from their dormitory and never came back. It was easier that way. Safer. And it was the beginning of what he would become. The fortress where angels are made. The fortress monastery sat on a dead moon orbiting a dying star. It was carved from solid rock and reinforced with metal stronger than anything found on most planets. Gothic spires reached toward the void like grasping fingers, each one housing training chambers, meditation cells, and 10,000 years of accumulated weapons and artifacts. This was where Space Marines were made. This was where boys went in and angels came out. If they survived. The real trials began immediately. They called it the Proving, but that name didn't capture the brutality of what followed. For 6 months, Marcus and the 31 other survivors were pushed beyond human limits. They ran obstacle courses in armor too heavy for their growing bodies. They fought combat exercises against robots programmed to hurt them, not just defeat them. They studied tactics and history until they could recite entire battles in their sleep, and then they were tested on that knowledge while being subjected to pain that would have driven most adults insane. 1 month in, only 18 remained. The others were buried in unmarked graves deep in the monastery's lower levels. Their names were recorded in the chapter archives but never spoken again. Marcus attended their burials without feeling anything. That part of him, the part that could feel sadness, was already starting to die. Then came the surgeries. The first organ implantation was the secondary heart. A backup cardiovascular system that would let them survive wounds that would kill normal humans. Marcus was awake during the procedure. They kept him conscious on purpose. Pain was part of the process, they explained. Learning to function while in agony was essential for any Space Marine. They were right. Over the years that followed, Marcus would be shot, stabbed, burned, frozen, poisoned, and crushed more times than he could count. The ability to ignore pain and keep fighting would save his life again and again. But it cost him something he didn't even realize he was losing. The ability to feel. Not just physical pain, but everything. Joy. Sadness. Love. Fear. All of it slowly faded away with each surgery, each conditioning session, each day spent in that fortress. More surgeries followed. The osmodula, which made his bones harder than steel. The biscopia, which turned his muscles into cables of enhanced tissue. The hemostamen, which changed his blood so he could survive in environments that would suffocate normal people. 19 implants in total, spread across several years. Each one brought him closer to becoming a space marine. Each one took him further from being human. Marcus stopped dreaming about home during this period. Stopped thinking about his mother's bread. About Thomas. About the purple sunsets of Verdun 7. The chapter's conditioning was designed to sever these connections, and it worked perfectly. By the time he received his final implant, the black carapace that would let him interface with Space Marine armor, Marcus had forgotten what it felt like to miss anything. He had forgotten he ever had a home to miss. The ceremony marking his full induction took place in the chapter's massive cathedral. Chaplain Mordred spoke the words that would bind Marcus's soul to the chapter's service forever. Marcus knelt and swore to defend humanity. To serve the Emperor. To die before bringing dishonor to the chapter. When he stood up, he was no longer Marcus from Verdun 7. He was Brother Marcus of the Emperor's Angels, 3rd Company. The boy he had been was dead. What rose in his place was something new. Something powerful. Something empty. First blood. Marcus's first real mission came 3 months after his induction. The target was a forge world called Metallus 9, an industrial planet covered in factories that produced weapons and equipment for the Imperium. Reports indicated possible chaos corruption among the factory workers. A team of Inquisition agents had been sent to investigate, but their communications had stopped 3 days earlier. Marcus's squad was sent to find out why. They made planetfall during the facility's night cycle, that dropped pods screaming through the atmosphere before slamming into the planet's primary industrial district. Marcus emerged from his pod into air thick with chemical smoke and the smell of burning metal. The silence was wrong. Metallus 9 should have been roaring with the sound of constant production. Instead, the streets lay empty except for flickering warning lights and distant mechanical hums. They found the source of the corruption in the deepest level of the primary factory. A shrine had been built in the reactor chamber, a twisted fusion of machinery and human flesh that pulsed with evil energy. Standing before it was something that had once been human but now served as a vessel for dark powers. It spoke to them in the voices of dead workers. Promised them knowledge beyond their understanding. Offered them power beyond their current limits. Showed them visions of what they could become if they abandoned their loyalty to the Emperor. Marcus felt nothing as he raised his bolter and fired 6 rounds through its chest. Nothing except satisfaction at completing his mission. The corrupted being collapsed. The shrine's power died. The factory could be cleansed and returned to production. They had won. They had served the Emperor. They had protected the Imperium. Everything had gone exactly as their training prepared them for. But one of Marcus's squad brothers made an observation that would haunt him for decades. The corrupted workers fought with desperate courage, Brother Valen noted. They died defending something they believed in. Something that gave their lives meaning. We killed them efficiently and without emotion. We served our function perfectly. But we felt nothing while doing it. This should have troubled Marcus. But it didn't. He had been conditioned to see emotional emptiness as strength, not loss. Only later, much later, would he begin to understand what Brother Valen had meant. The campaigns blended together over the following decades. Orc invasions on farming worlds where they killed thousands of greenskins while local populations cheered. Battles against Tau forces equipped with advanced technology that could match their armor pound for pound. defense operations against Tyranid swarms where they fought until ammunition ran low and then continued with combat knives until reinforcements arrived or they died. Each campaign taught Marcus new lessons about warfare, about tactics, about the countless ways to kill enemies of the Imperium. He became very good at his job, very efficient, very effective, but he never learned to care about the people he was protecting. The billions of Imperial citizens whose lives depended on his battles remained abstract concepts. There were strategic assets to be preserved when possible and acceptable losses when necessary. Nothing more. This emotional detachment served him well when deployed to deal with rebellions on civilized worlds. Worlds where Imperial citizens had been led by charismatic leaders who promised them better lives if they threw off Imperial rule. On Castella IV, Marcus fought through residential districts where every building had been turned into a fortress by citizens who believed death was better than surrender. They used furniture as barricades, kitchen knives as weapons, their own children as shields because they knew Marcus and his brothers would not hesitate to fire through civilians to reach their objectives. They were right. Marcus didn't hesitate. Couldn't hesitate. He killed a woman on Castella IV who was trying to evacuate her baby from a building his squad needed to secure. She was unarmed, posed no threat, was clearly just trying to save her child. But she was in the way. Marcus put a single bolt round through her chest and kept moving. The baby died moments later when his squad brother used grenades to clear the rest of the building. Marcus felt nothing. No regret. No guilt. No sense that he had done something wrong. The woman had been an obstacle. Her death allowed them to complete their mission more efficiently. The baby was an acceptable casualty in service of the greater objective. These were facts, not tragedies. But that night, during meditation, Marcus tried to remember what the woman had looked like. He realized he couldn't form a clear image of her face, even though he had killed her just hours earlier. She had been human, female, approximately 30 years old. But beyond those basic details, she hadn't registered as worth remembering. She had been an obstacle. Nothing more. This troubled Marcus, not because he felt guilt, but because he wondered if his conditioning was interfering with his ability to gather tactical intelligence. If he couldn't remember the faces of people he killed, how could he be certain he wasn't missing important details? He brought his concerns to the chaplain. The response was clear. His inability to form emotional attachments to individuals he killed was evidence of successful conditioning, not a problem. This was exactly what the chapter required. Over the following decades, this emotional emptiness proved strategically valuable. Marcus could fight through civilian areas without hesitation, make triage decisions about wounded comrades without being distracted by personal attachment, sacrifice squad members when necessary without grief clouding his judgment. But it also meant he would never experience the satisfaction of protecting something he cared about. Victory became a technical achievement rather than an emotional reward. Success meant nothing more than completing objectives according to acceptable parameters. Uncomfortable truths. As Marcus gained experience and rose through the ranks, first to veteran status, then to sergeant, he began to observe patterns in their deployment assignments that revealed uncomfortable truths. They were not primarily deployed to defend humanity against external threats, as the propaganda suggested. They were deployed to enforce compliance with imperial authority, regardless of whether that authority served the interests of the populations they protected. On Vos Prime, they suppressed a worker uprising triggered by the planetary governor's decision to increase production quotas while cutting food rations. The workers hadn't been corrupted by chaos or manipulated by aliens. They had simply concluded that their current conditions were unsustainable and that organized resistance might improve things. They were wrong. Marcus's intervention ensured their conditions became significantly worse. But their compliance with imperial tax requirements improved dramatically. On Morian, they participated in pacifying a religious movement that had developed interpretations of imperial doctrine that differed from official church teachings. Their heresies were minor, questions about theology that scholars had debated for millennia. But their growing influence threatened local church officials' authority. Marcus and his brothers killed approximately 40,000 civilians during the 3-week campaign, including entire settlements that had embraced the unofficial teachings. On Necromunda, they supported police operations against gangs interfering with imperial tax collection. The gangs were brutal organizations that preyed on civilians for profit. But they were also the only check on corporate overlords whose exploitation exceeded even imperial standards. Marcus's elimination of gang resistance resulted in improved tax collection. But it also led to working conditions that killed more civilians in the following year than gang violence had killed in the previous decade. Each campaign was a tactical success. Each achieved its objectives with minimal resource expenditure. Each strengthened imperial control. But they also illustrated a fundamental contradiction at the heart of Space Marine existence. They were created to protect humanity. But they spent most of their time killing humans who had reached different conclusions about their own interests than imperial administrators had. They were sold as humanity's guardians. But they functioned as humanity's wardens. This realization should have troubled Marcus. But it didn't. The conditioning that made him an effective warrior also made him incapable of questioning the assumptions underlying his service. He could observe patterns. But he could not evaluate those patterns according to moral criteria that might suggest alternatives. He served because he had been programmed to serve. Not because he believed service was valuable. The mission that changed everything. Marcus's 4th century of service brought assignment to the Death Watch, an elite organization tasked with eliminating alien threats to imperial space. His first assignment should have provided the moral clarity he had lost. Aliens weren't human. They couldn't claim imperial citizenship. They could be killed without ambiguity because their existence threatened human survival. But even here, clarity proved elusive. The target was a Tau diplomatic mission attempting to establish trade relationships with imperial worlds along the border. The Tau were offering advanced medical technology in exchange for raw materials their expanding empire needed. Several planetary governors had expressed interest. They saw opportunities to improve conditions for their populations while maintaining required tax levels. The Inquisition determined these negotiations represented an unacceptable security risk. Not because the Tau were planning military action, but because their diplomatic success might encourage other alien species to attempt similar approaches. The Imperium's policy toward alien life was extinction, not coexistence. Any deviation would be interpreted as weakness. Marcus's kill team eliminated the Tau delegation during a formal dinner. 43 aliens died in the initial assault, along with 17 human negotiators and 26 staff members present when they breached the facility. The tactical execution was flawless. No Tau survived to report the incident. The elimination of human witnesses ensured word would not spread. The diplomatic mission disappeared without trace. But intelligence reports recovered from the Tau revealed complicating information. The Tau had been attempting trade not for conquest, but to support refugee populations displaced by Tyranid invasions. They needed resources to maintain civilian survival rates. Their medical technology offers were genuine attempts to provide value in exchange for materials the imperial worlds could spare. The Tau had been trying to save lives. Not human lives, but lives nonetheless. They had been offering solutions to problems that killed thousands of imperial citizens every year. They had been trying to create relationships that might reduce conflict. And Marcus had killed them for it. This should not have mattered. Tau were still aliens regardless of circumstances. Their survival wasn't his responsibility, and their destruction served imperial interests. But for the first time in 3 centuries, Marcus found himself questioning whether completing mission objectives necessarily constituted success. Not from emotional attachment to the dead Tau, but from a tactical perspective considering longer-term consequences. The elimination had prevented trade relationships. But it had also eliminated intelligence-gathering opportunities that might have provided valuable information about Tau capabilities and intentions. It had strengthened imperial isolation but sacrificed strategic flexibility that might prove crucial in future conflicts. These observations troubled Marcus, not because he felt regret, but because they suggested decision-making processes governing their deployments might be prioritizing abstract principles over concrete results. If the Imperium's survival was truly the primary objective, shouldn't they be willing to compromise on ideological positions when such compromises offered strategic advantages? But the conditioning that made him an effective warrior also made him incapable of pursuing such questions to their logical conclusions. He could observe inconsistencies but could not evaluate whether those inconsistencies were problems requiring solutions or necessary sacrifices in service of objectives he wasn't qualified to understand. He served because he had been programmed to serve. The fact that he no longer understood why his service was valuable did not change his obligation to continue. The world that doesn't exist. The final revelation came during Marcus's 5th century of service, on a world whose name he was ordered to forget immediately upon mission completion. A world that officially did not exist in Imperial records, though it had once been home to 17 billion human souls. They were deployed not to fight aliens or heretics, but to eliminate evidence of a failed experiment. The world's population had been selected for a project that would create humans capable of surviving in environments too hostile for normal colonization. Enhanced lung capacity for thin atmospheres. Modified skin for high radiation. Improved bone density for heavy gravity. The project succeeded beyond expectations. The modified humans could indeed thrive in hostile environments. But they had also developed capabilities their creators hadn't anticipated. Enhanced cognitive function. Improved disease resistance. Extended lifespans that exceeded normal human ranges by centuries. They had become something new. Something that might eventually supersede baseline humanity entirely. This could not be allowed. The Imperium was built on the assumption that human nature was static. That the species had achieved its perfect form and any deviation represented corruption rather than evolution. The modified humans represented a challenge to every principle justifying imperial authority. If humanity could be improved through scientific manipulation, perhaps other aspects of imperial doctrine were equally open to revision. The solution was total population elimination, followed by orbital bombardment that would reduce the world's surface to molten glass. Space Marines were chosen for the mission not because of combat capabilities, but because of psychological conditioning. Normal soldiers might experience moral qualms about exterminating human populations that posed no threat. But Space Marines could be relied upon to follow orders regardless of personal feelings. Because they no longer had personal feelings that might interfere. The campaign lasted 6 months. Not because the modified humans offered significant military resistance, but because 17 billion individuals required time to locate and eliminate. They had built cities extending deep underground. They had developed technologies allowing them to remain hidden. They had created social structures prioritizing collective survival over individual preservation. They fought with desperate courage. Not mindless fury or mechanical determination, but calculated ferocity of people who understood exactly what Marcus's victory would mean. They knew he hadn't come to conquer or demand compliance. They knew he had come to eliminate them entirely. To erase their existence so completely that no trace would survive to inspire others. They fought like humans defending their families, their homes, their future. They fought with passionate commitment Marcus had observed in corrupted workers on Medalist 9, but directed toward preservation rather than destruction. They fought for something they loved more than life itself. And Marcus killed them all. Every man, woman, and child. Every family line. Every cultural tradition. Every technological innovation that might have improved the human condition. He eliminated a civilization that had achieved in 3 generations what the Imperium had struggled with for 10,000 years. Not because they threatened humanity, but because they represented what humanity might become. Marcus was present for the final phase, the elimination of the last underground shelter where approximately 12,000 civilians had taken refuge. Men and women who had never taken up arms. Children born after his arrival who would die before their first birthdays. Elderly individuals whose only crime was surviving long enough to witness their species peak. They weren't hiding when Marcus breached their final defenses. They weren't begging for mercy. They were singing. 12,000 voices raised in harmonies that resonated through the tunnels they had called home. Melodies speaking of love and loss and hope despite certain extinction. They were singing because they wanted their last act as a species to be beautiful rather than desperate, creative rather than destructive, human rather than merely functional. Marcus killed them while they sang. His bolter sang its own hymn as shells found their targets, each shot precisely calculated for maximum casualties with minimum ammunition expenditure. The music stopped in sections as voices were silenced forever, until only echoes remained to mark the passage of the last genetically enhanced humans in the galaxy. When the killing finished and orbital bombardment began, Marcus stood on his strike cruiser's command deck and watched the world die. Torpedoes cracked its crust while virus bombs sterilized any organic material that might have survived ground operations. Within 6 hours, the world that had been home to 17 billion enhanced humans had become a ball of cooling magma orbiting a star that would be removed from navigation charts. The mission was a complete success. What was lost? As Marcus watched that world burn, something happened that hadn't occurred in centuries. He remembered the taste of his mother's bread. Sweet honey and grain from the southern fields of Verdant 7, baked in the early hours before work bells rang. The memory came without warning, without context, without explanation. He hadn't thought about his mother or childhood or anything connected to his previous existence since his first century of service. The conditioning had successfully eliminated such attachments as unnecessary impediments. Yet somehow, watching the destruction of 17 billion people who died singing, Marcus remembered what it felt like to be human. He remembered what it felt like to taste something made with love rather than mere nutritional necessity. To anticipate pleasure rather than simply endure existence. To be part of something that existed for reasons beyond tactical efficiency. And he realized what he had lost. Not just his humanity, which he'd been taught to regard as necessary sacrifice. Not just his capacity for emotional response, which he'd been conditioned to see as weakness. He had lost the ability to understand what made life worth living. What made survival worth struggling for. What made existence preferable to extinction. The enhanced humans had died singing because they still remembered what it meant to be human despite their modifications. They had preserved something systematically stripped from Marcus during his transformation. They had remained capable of love, hope, beauty, all the things giving meaning to existence beyond mere biological function. Marcus had become something that could eliminate beauty without comprehending what beauty was. That could destroy love without understanding what love meant. That could extinguish hope while remaining ignorant of what hope offered. He had become the perfect servant of an empire that preserved humanity by destroying everything that made humanity worth preserving. But this realization changed nothing. He could observe the loss without regretting it. Understand the sacrifice without questioning its necessity. Recognize the price without considering it excessive. The conditioning that created these capabilities had also ensured he would continue serving regardless of his personal assessment of that service's value. He was incapable of rebellion. Incapable of doubt. Incapable of choosing a different path even if he could imagine what such a path might entail. He was exactly what the Imperium needed him to be. Nothing more. Nothing less. The truth about angels. The centuries since that nameless world have blended together into an endless cycle of deployment and victory, conflict and resolution, service without purpose or satisfaction or hope of anything beyond continued service. Marcus has killed millions of enemies, protected billions of citizens, preserved the stability of countless worlds against threats both internal and external. He has served the Emperor faithfully for over 400 years, and will continue serving until battle damage or age finally claims his enhanced physiology. He is a hero of the Imperium. A living legend. A guardian angel protecting humanity from darkness beyond the stars. Children throughout Imperial space dream of becoming what he has become. They imagine wielding his weapons and wearing his armor. They see him as the embodiment of everything noble about human civilization. A figure worthy of worship and emulation. They do not know that Marcus can no longer remember why their dreams matter. They do not know he has forgotten what it feels like to care about anything beyond completing assigned objectives. They do not know he has become something that can protect them without understanding what makes them worth protecting. That can serve their interests without comprehending what those interests entail. They do not know that in becoming their guardian, he ceased to be one of them. Finally, the greatest victory chaos never needed. And perhaps that is the greatest victory chaos could achieve against the Imperium. Not the corruption of its servants, but the creation of servants so pure in their dedication that they can no longer comprehend the value of what they serve. Not the destruction of humanity, but the transformation of humanity's protectors into something that preserves human life without preserving human meaning. Space Marines are the Emperor's finest warriors. The shield standing between mankind and the darkness that would devour it. But they are no longer human. And they have forgotten why humanity matters. They will continue serving. Continue fighting. Continue killing in the Emperor's name until nothing remains but echoes of bolter fire and memories of wars whose purpose they can no longer recall. They are angels without heaven. Guardians without understanding. Protectors without love. They are exactly what they were designed to be. The recruitment posters show shining heroes saving grateful civilians. The propaganda films portray noble warriors defending the innocent. The cathedral murals depict silver saints whose bolters sing hymns of righteousness. But the truth is darker and more tragic than any propaganda could admit. To become a Space Marine, you gain strength beyond human limits. You acquire weapons and armor that make you nearly invincible. You become part of something larger and more significant than any individual could achieve alone. But you lose the ability to choose your own path. You lose the capacity for doubt, for questioning, for independent thought that might lead you to make decisions based on conviction rather than obligation. You lose the ability to form meaningful relationships because you are no longer human yourself. You become a tool in service of an ideal you can no longer comprehend because you lack the emotional capacity to understand what makes that ideal worth preserving. This is what they never tell the children of Verdant 7 and a million other worlds like it. This is what the chaplains don't explain when they come recruiting with their promises of glory and honor. Yes, you will become an angel. Yes, you will save countless lives. Yes, you will serve the greatest cause in human history. But you will do it all without understanding why any of it matters. You will protect humanity without remembering what makes humanity worth protecting. You will fight for the Emperor without comprehending why the Emperor's vision deserves your service. You will become the perfect weapon, the ultimate soldier, the ideal servant. And you will lose everything that made you human in the process. Marcus stands in the armoring chambers of his fortress monastery, watching crimson paint dry on his ceramite plates. 437 years have passed since he last tasted his mother's bread. 437 years since he was called anything other than Brother Marcus of the Emperor's Angels, 3rd Company. He is a hero, a legend, an angel, and he cannot remember why any of it matters. But he will continue serving, because that is what he was made to do, because he has no choice, because he has forgotten how to choose. This is the truth about Space Marines that the Imperium will never admit. They are not humanity's salvation. They are humanity's tragedy. The greatest warriors ever created, who lost their humanity in order to save it. The perfect protectors, who can no longer understand what they protect or why it needs protecting. Angels who have forgotten what heaven looks like. And somewhere, on dead worlds whose names have been erased from imperial records, voices still echo in empty tunnels. Singing. Always singing. Reminding the universe of what was lost when humanity decided that angels were more important than people. That victory was more important than understanding why victory mattered. That survival was more important than meaning. The Space Marines will continue their eternal war. They will win countless battles. They will save billions of lives. But they will do it all without ever knowing why. And perhaps, in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, that is the greatest tragedy of all.